Hello students, I am going to do a couple different videos today so that you can go back and watch them separately if you want to. This one will be a review of chapters 5 and 6 and of the worksheets that you turned in. I'll also drop into our files keys of those worksheets that you have the answers to them. I'm not sure how, when I return things to you, if you continue to have access to them or not. So I'll drop those in the files so that you can see them. And then the next video I'll do is going to review some literary devices that we have looked for in some of these questions that you've worked on. And that will be on the test for you to identify in passages. And then the last video I'll post today is a review of the couple paragraphs that I'm going to ask you to write for your test on Friday. Friday will be an open book test. You'll have everything accessible to you, any of the worksheets that we've done or feedback I've given you, notes you've taken. You'll be expected to do it in the same amount of time that you would normally spend on a Friday amount of school homework. So it'll just be an analysis test basically, and you'll have a good bit of feedback between now and then if you participate in the discussion on Teams, which I'll ask you to do today and tomorrow as well. So I imagine the test should be pretty straightforward and quick and not too difficult for you. That is something once you start it, you need to work on it on your own. You should not work with a classmate on this one, like I normally encourage you to do on your worksheets. So do please finish the test on your own. All right, so chapter 5. In chapter 5, we met Monsieur and Madame Defarge is how you would say their names. And they are French peasants who own a wine shop in Paris, in France. We find out as we continue reading the story that Monsieur Defarge was once a servant to Dr. Manette. And he is the one that's caring for Dr. Manette right now. Dr. Manette is staying out there in the wine shop. And so he is the one that takes Mr. Lorry and Lucy to speak with Dr. Manette first. In chapter 5, it begins with this very strange scene of this wine casket that is, and imagine a giant barrel, right? Not just like a small flagon, if you will, or a day's worth of wine, but a giant barrel fell off the back of this cart and spilled in the streets. And these peasants, they're very, very poor. So they've not had anything, they've maybe never ever tasted anything like this quality of wine before. So they start to drink it up out of the streets. And it's very, it's kind of disgusting if you think about it, but it's also extremely symbolic. And the most vivid explanation of it or description of it came on page 32. When they had finished drinking it up, it was gone. It was now either soaked into the mud, which that's really, really disgusting. There was no sewer system. There was no drains in France and Paris at the time. And so people threw their dirty water, their sewage, everything just into the streets. So that's what these people are drinking up, right? It's supposed to make your stomach turn a little bit. And at the very end, one of the men, it says, dipped his finger now in the muddy mix of wine and wrote blood on the wall. So this is a foreshadowing that the streets of Paris, these dirty streets of Paris, are going to be washed in blood. Remember, foreshadowing, we talked about foreshadowing in 6th grade a good bit, and I think we talked about it with Enemy Brothers. But foreshadowing is giving a preview or a concept or an idea of what's to come through imagery, right? Which this is a major scene of imagery, but also through description or through, it's almost like a literary form of prophecy. It's not intended to be prophetic in the sense of God's spokesperson, but it's giving us a glimpse into the future of what we're going to see. And so clearly here, this wine that has washed the streets and that has whipped these peasants up into a frenzy, they're crazy over it, is foreshadowing, looking ahead to that French Revolution, when they will be the ones that are standing around the guillotine cheering for blood as it splatters their faces, or They sit there knitting as the guillotine is chopping off heads, right? We see these images that we remember. We see the foreshadowing of these images that we remember from Scarlet Pimpernel. Do you remember in Scarlet Pimpernel that it talked about the old cads sat around the front of the guillotine and they just sat there knitting? Well, that's a trope based off of this character, Madame Defarge, who is always seen knitting. And so that's where you see that image come up in Scarlet Pimpernel as well. So then question 2 asks, who are the, quote, lords in waiting on the saintly presence of the impoverished Saint Antoine? So this is very much personification, right? Remember, personification is giving a non-human thing human attributes. Be careful, it's not giving it animal attributes. Some of you got a little confused on that in your final from last trimester when I asked what literary device was being used in those 2 poems. Some of you used personification. Those poems, it was metaphor, right? It was calling them something else. And the hope is like a thing with feathers. It's calling it a bird. A bird's not a person, so that couldn't be personification. But the lords in waiting on the saintly presence, it's referring to who's ruling over these people right now, or more specifically, what is. And these lords are cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and most specifically, want. So that's personification, and that's where Dickens uses this concept of rulers, to describe what's driving the people right now. We've seen, and then anaphora is that next literary device that we talk about in chapter 5. You say that anaphora, and it is where a keyword or words is repeated at the beginning of successive clauses or near the beginning. It doesn't have to be the first word, but at or near the beginning of successive clauses. And so what we read about there was the word hunger was repeated over and over and over again. And then shown in all different ways throughout the town. It was shown in the ways that the houses were patched poorly, where fires were not built because there was no point in it. There was no food to cook, so why build a fire? The stores had very little food to sell, and there are other examples in there, but those are the 3 that I picked out. The rest of chapter 5 was introducing Madame and Monsieur Defarge. One note to see, and if you didn't look it up at the end, that's just fine. A couple of you have asked about the numbers that are in the books. Those are called end notes, and if you flip to the back of the book, we had to look at a few of them at the very beginning of the book when you were looking up the king and queen. But you don't have to look every single one of those up. Sometimes they're really useful, and sometimes they're just extra information. And I'll try to let you know when they're really useful. But one of the ones, if you didn't look it up, you'll notice that Madame Defarge called her husband Jacques, which is the French version of Jack. And it simply was referring, Jacques was a name that they gave, that everybody called French peasants. It was just the nickname. Do you remember what they called them in Scarlet Pimpernel? What they called each other? Everybody was called citoyen or citizen. This was their attempt to make everybody equal. So previously, like we're seeing happen now, they called them Jacques, which would have been, when the peasants used it with each other, it was okay. But if another person used it with the peasants, it was derogatory. It was pointing out that he's a peasant or she's a peasant. So that's what she was calling her husband. We see the Monsieur Defarge treat Lucy in a way that's really interesting. He does bow to her. He gets on his knees and he takes her hand and he kisses it. But he's not very happy about it. And again, we're going to see this constant tension between the old ways of showing respect. This idea that, well, she's a lady and so we're going to be respectful to her, and she's a lady of a higher station than I am, and so I'm definitely going to be respectful to her. But throughout the book, that gets washed away. He does it now out of habit because he has to, but he's not very pleased to do it. But we're going to see that get destroyed and torn down as the French Revolution really takes over. the whole point of the French Revolution was to get rid of anybody above them. They wanted to try to make everybody equal. In doing so, they made everybody equally miserable, except for the very few that ruled over them. But that is what we see. Monsieur Defarge recognized her as, well, if Dr. Manette was my master, then she is my master's child, and so still has some, he still has some respect for her in that way. All right, and then he takes them up to the loft, the garret way up high, where Dr. Manette is being kept. One of the strange things that happens at the very end of chapter 6 is that when they go up there, Mr. Lorry notices these three men who are just looking at Dr. Manette. Monsieur Defarge allowed them to go up there just to look at him, almost as if he's a something on display, like an animal in a zoo or something. And I want you to think about, why would he do that? He says it's a good thing that they see him. Remember, Dr. Manette was unlawfully, or unrightly at least, imprisoned by the previous government in France. And so this is Mr. Defarge's opportunity to point out to these young men who could be great helps in running the revolution, that look at how evil the government is. Look at how awful it is. So anyway, that's why he shows them off. So then we get to meet Dr. Manette, and Dr. Manette is a man that's been imprisoned for 20 years. He is ruined. He is, his health is destroyed and broken. Remember, he was a doctor. He was very smart, and his mind is gone. We see him call himself by a number when asked what his name is or who the shoemaker is. And he says 105 North Tower. That was his prison number. If you're familiar with the story Les Miserables, Jean Valjean is given a number, and that's all he is. He's not a name for many years. He's a number. So this is a similar concept. Dr. Manette's just been a number for so long, but he doesn't even remember who he was or his name. Throughout his time in prison, he begged to be allowed to make shoes, and he said it took quite a while before they allowed him to, but they finally did allow him to make shoes. And so that's what he does now. That's where he takes refuge, is in making shoes. You'll find lots of descriptions to answer the questions 1 and 2 on the worksheets. You'll find lots of descriptions on pages 43 and 44 that you could use. Just make sure you notice the difference between his voice and then his physical features as well. An example of Dr. Manette's inability to interact with his visitors. Remember, he has to ask Mr. Defarge to repeat everything he says. Anytime he asks a question, he can't hold it in his mind long enough to remember the answer of the question. And so he has to ask Monsieur Defarge to repeat it each time. He also then had a hard time remembering things, not just remembering the answer to the question, but the question that was just asked seemed to be difficult for him to remember them. The little packet that Dr. Manette has around his neck, it held one or two long golden hairs that perfectly matched Lucy's hair. So we can assume that these were the hairs of her mother, and we'll find that out for sure shortly here, but that's what we assume. And Lucy appears to look so like her mother that it confused Dr. Manette. He look and sound like her mother. He kept saying, but it's been so long. He recognizes them as the same as Lucy's hair. He recognizes Lucy's voice as that of his wife's, but he's very confused because she appears not to have aged over these 20 years, over this passage of time. And so that really, really baffles him, really confuses him. Finally, when Mr. Lorry is helping Dr. Manette into the carriage and they're getting ready to leave Paris, he asks them the question, I hope you care to be called back to life. And Dr. Manette responds, I can't say. So I can't say is another phrase for I don't know. I don't know if I want to be called back to life. Right? Remember, the life that Dr. Manette knew before he lost his mind was to be imprisoned. And he only has sad memories of losing his wife and his child, of losing his freedom, of the travesties that happened to him while he was in prison that caused him to lose his mind. And so right now he just says, I can't say. I don't know if I want to be called back to life right now. And that's where we finish book 1. So there's your quick review of chapters 5 and 6. I'll upload keys to, I think I'll put them in the file section of Teams. Under book 1, I'll upload the keys to those. And, excuse me, hopefully get you your graded work back quickly. I'm still trying to sort out how that return function works in Teams. Next, I want you to go and watch the video of the literary devices that we've talked about as we've been reading this chapter, and there might be a couple others that we talked about before, but we're going to apply to this chapter as well. So go watch that, and then we'll talk about the game that we'll play and the paragraph that you're going to be writing. Thanks.